The debate, who won, who lost, next on the Academics. Greetings, I'm Lee Dunstan. Welcome to the Academics. Allow me to introduce our panel. Dr. Nancy Love of App Stage Department of Government and Justice Studies, Dr. Michael Wade of the History Department, and Dr. Paul Gates of our Communication Department here at Appalachian State. Everybody is talking about the Republican debate. What really happened? I know everybody wants to talk about who won, who lost. The real question, I think, is what really happened during this extravaganza with the many people on the stage. Paul, can you get us rolling on this issue of the Republican debate?
Well, I think what happened was that a number of the candidates strayed from the facts. As often happens in these settings, and of course, I think Donald Trump led my count with the most times he misspoke. Brought up the old story of vaccines linked to autism, which has been repeatedly disproven. The physician who started that had his license yanked. Trump also denied that he had ever approached Jeb Bush for a casino in Florida, when there's ample evidence that he did indeed. He claimed that the United States is the only country with birthright citizenship, which is not true. Mexico has it too. Carly Fiorina even made a couple of outrageous claims. She talked about the Planned Parenthood videos in very graphic terms about an aborted fetus with heart beating and so forth, harvested for a brain, that there is no such video.
Let me stop you there, Paul. That's really interesting to me. Presumably her most dramatic moment of the whole evening, and maybe the most dramatic moment of the entire debate, was when Carly Fiorina graphically described a fetus on a table, right, its legs kicking, its heart beating, just about ready for somebody to harvest its brain. Mm-hmm. and the most disgusting imaginable thought. And it turns out that it's not true?
There is no such video, no.
So help me here. What do we do with people who aspire to the presidency and talk about a scene that is attributed to Planned Parenthood or another organization and tell us all that we have no morality unless we drop the hammer on them? What do we do?
I can jump in real quickly there.
Please jump in.
We have two physicians
before I jump on the table.
And Paul on the debate who didn't call her on that.
Mm-hmm. That's a good point. Right.
I think what we do with them is the only thing we can do. We endure them. And hope that somebody calls them out. I think the big loser in the debate was the public. I don't think there's any question about that. Good government requires substance. Not half-baked good intentions. Certainly not pandering to the lowest elements out there.
And not claims fabricated out of whole cloth. I mean, particularly claims that outrageous, as you point out, Lee, that really call into question fundamental values and so forth. I don't think we can endure them, Mike. I think they've really got to be called out. I think it's.
Well, I think they do, but we can't make them disappear. Is what I was saying. I think that that was Carly Fiorina's lowest moment. Mm-hmm. I don't think it was her worst moment.
She also said she wouldn't talk to Putin.
She manfully said that she would deal with Vladimir Putin's support for Syria's Assad. by beefing up NATO's presence in Poland and in the Baltic states, that is, on Russia's borders. If we know anything about Russia, it is that it is one of the more paranoid states on the planet, and rightly so, given their history. They have a fear of foreign invasion, particularly from the West. That sort of suggestion that we try to intimidate them in that way is irresponsible madness. And
she did know better on domestic issues. I mean, she misrepresented her tenure at Hewlett-Packard, saying that they doubled their sales when that was largely due to their purchase of Compaq. And she, plays fast and loose with other statistics in an area that she should be quite familiar with, but chose to ignore some of those facts.
Fact, she was fired from Hewlett-Packard.
She was indeed.
She is, though, the one woman in a large field, which is not suggesting that we shouldn't hold her responsible, but I don't think we should focus our frustration with the debate entirely on her. And to go back to Mike's point about what American citizens deserve, don't citizens get the candidates and the debates they demand? And this is now being touted by CNN as one of the most popular TV shows of the year with NFL-level ratings. Why are the American citizens being entertained?
You're absolutely right. H.L. Mencken famously said that democracy was the proposition that the American public deserved to have what it wanted, and it deserved to get it good and hard. And the Republicans are hell-bent on helping them to do just that. Apparently so is CNN. The backdrop for that show should not have been Reagan's Air Force One. It should have been a Carnival cruise liner. Most of the candidates played fast and loose with the facts, as you've already suggested, and were not even well-intentioned. Case in point, the candidates' wide agreement on the fundamentally dishonest charge that everything that's wrong in the Middle East is the fault of President Obama. George Bush the Elder energized al-Qaeda by stationing troops in Saudi Arabia and leaving them there after the first Gulf War. George Bush the Lesser, asleep at the wheel in the lead up to 9/11, invaded Iraq, creating chaos there that may never be resolved. Candidates who can't or won't admit to readily observable facts are a danger to this country.
Well, and a good example of readily observable facts is Rubio's claim that working on climate change would accomplish nothing, when that has been refuted by the vast majority of scientists.
And this is a guy from Miami.
Right, one of the more endangered states from
an
sea level
endangered
rise.
city.
Sure.
So I did a quick polling myself of the folks on that panel, on the Republican debate panel, that seemed to say they wouldn't immediately tear up the Iran agreement. The ones that I counted were John Kasich, Jeb Bush, Ron Paul, and interestingly, Donald Trump probably wouldn't tear up the Iran agreement because he claims he's such a good enforcer of contracts. The ones that would immediately tear it up are Ted Cruz, Carly Fiorina, Mike Huckabee, and Marco Rubio. Does this suggest a cleavage in the Republican Party that may not be resolved in this election or for many elections to come?
I think it only suggests that for the people that you've mentioned, and I thought Rand Paul had a pretty good night, there are, for that handful, there are some links to which they will not go.
So that when John Kasich seems to say we can't do everything by ourselves, he's just saying he's just receding from his natural inclination to do bad stuff?
Well, it's a win-win for him because it underscores his actual experience, and I think that there's that as well.
Two thoughts there. In terms of a cleavage within the GOP, some of the candidates have moved to the right of Reagan, and so the setting was very ironic. Reagan was willing to negotiate with our enemies. He recognized the necessity of that for American national security. The other thing is there's another cleavage, I think, at work. There are the anti-politicians, right? Fiorina and Carson and Trump, and then there are the GOP regulars. And how that's going to play out over the course of the campaign will be really interesting as well.
That's I'm so glad you brought that up. That's something that really needs attention. Our country has serious problems that require serious candidates, and this group, with some exceptions, would make most of our some of our problems worse while ignoring the real ones. There's unmistakable evidence that the federal government today does so many things that require a high level of professional skill and understanding that settling for mediocrity in public service and otherwise trashing the government is an invitation to mediocrity as a nation. It's just crystal clear. Our very survival may well depend on good, effective government. Who in that crowd is for good, effective government?
Paul, what do you think?
Well, I'd have to put Kasich at the top of that heap, Mike. I think I think there is that cleavage, and in the split that you identified, Lee. You do have a more moderate wing there. I mean, the whole wing is pretty far to the right, but there is a somewhat of a center, I think, to that. And the rest, who are the ones making the really outrageous claims, are the pandering to the base types.
Well, let me make an observation and then we'll move on to another subject. If you have John Kasich saying what he said and appearing in that group to be moderate in that group, and if you have Jeb Bush speaking Spanish, having a Mexican-American wife, and appearing to be somewhat moderate, and one guy is from Ohio, the other fellow is from Florida, isn't that a potent mix for the establishment to get behind as a way of actually having a shot in what seems to be quite unlikely of actually taking back the White House?
I think I think your question is a good one, but I think the question is if they wind up with the George Bush, how well has George Bush done in these debates?
Jeb Bush.
Jeb Bush. Excuse me. He strikes me as a whole lot like his brother. And does the country want more of that?
Well, before we can even get there, they have to deal with Donald Trump. And right now, the Democratic National Committee is just letting the Republicans solve that problem by holding back on their own debates.
And let me talk a little bit about Trump. So let's move on from the debate and move on to Trump's rally in New Hampshire the next day after the debate. The first question, he took questions and he did a question and answer, Q&A. The first question came from somebody that identified himself as being from New Hampshire. And then the first thing he said was, what are we going to do about Obama, who is a Muslim, and he's not an American? Trump was nodding his head yes. He was nodding his head yes. And then he said, what are we going to do about these Muslim terror camps that are growing? When are we going to get rid of the Muslims? And Trump nodded his head, and his response was, we're going to be looking into that. I hear that a lot. We're going to be looking into that.
Well, he's giving it legitimacy. He's giving a crazy claim legitimacy, which is just continuing his normal approach to everything in this, making outrageous claims. When I was talking about pandering to the base, there you go. That's it.
Now, if that's the base,
we're in trouble.
If that's the base, what are we really talking about? Where are we? It's pretty clear that Donald Trump 2 years ago got headlines all the time, kind of political quasi, P.T. Barnum kind of headlines, by calling Obama doing the birther routine. Mm-hmm. Now, he's listening to some insane question and acknowledging it, and we're going to look into it. Where are we?
Well, we've debased political discourse. I don't see any further down to go at this point. I think that's beyond the pale.
Well, and if our viewers, sorry.
Go on.
If our viewers haven't seen it yet, Bernie Sanders tweeted the debate. He didn't tweet this town hall meeting, but he was fact-checking. And I hope he will continue to do that, because one of the responsibilities of a leader is to educate the base.
I mean, isn't it part of the American political scene, if you go all the way back to the beginning of the Republic, it's part of the American political scene that there's a kind of an irrationality that creeps into every campaign, with every campaign. But what we're talking about here are people who are talking about ethnic cleansing, and they appear to be the base of the Republican Party's leader in the polls, and who has billions of dollars. That's kind of where we are as we sit here today.
Well, this is the cup of hemlock that the Republicans swallowed back in the late 1960s when they took the segregationists and the fundamentalists.
Now let me stop you right there, Mike.
Party.
Let me stop you right there. Push ourselves back into the 1930s in Germany. Was somebody on the radio program like this saying, this is the cup of hemlock the National Socialist Party, the Nazis, drank when they elected and they embraced Adolf Hitler? I mean, I know we're not supposed to say Nazis and Hitler, but I mean, this is stuff I've never heard before in my time as a living American. I have never heard a presidential candidate acknowledge this kind of insanity coming from some part of his little Q&A crowd. In New Hampshire.
A couple of things. I didn't see the question and answer, but I did pick up on his nodding of his head. That may, I'm not defending, but that may merely have signified, yes, I'm listening. However, the answer, at the best that can be said, is he slipped the questions.
That's the best.
The question demanded an answer that said, no, the president is not a Muslim. He is a citizen. Let's get beyond that. And I think that goes to something else. I think we largely agreed earlier that these candidates need to be called on what they say. So does the public. Because unless that starts to, in my estimation, people like that in New Hampshire, down south, and elsewhere are people who need to be called for what they are: prejudiced, ignorant, and otherwise we may well wind up, in effect, energizing and affirming these people by silence. And we may wind up with something that we really don't like, maybe something like the third.
And who has the main responsibility for that? Is it folks like us sitting around talking about this in a panel discussion? Or do the Republican candidates who seek to be president, who have any credibility, have the responsibility to say, this happened in New Hampshire, Trump didn't stop it, it needs to be stopped?
Yeah, that needs to be said. We're talking, if you want to be a leader, you better, leadership qualities are called for.
Anyway, I don't know. It really, as you can tell, it got me excited.
I think that answer goes to character to some extent. It's
but of course, he's in a box, isn't he? If he's the P.T. Barnum we think he is, and 2 years ago he was birtherizing, what does he do when some guy stands up at New Hampshire when he's leading in the polls? He's almost in the box.
Yeah, you're right.
Because you've got to keep extending your claims to keep that momentum going, that crazy momentum that's driving these types of stances.
Okay, well, let's keep our momentum going here today. I think we need to have just as much passion and discussion as we did about these Republicans in their debate about the refugee crisis in Europe. It is a cataclysm. Hundreds of thousands of people running for their lives, running for food, running not to be tortured. What will the West do about that, including the United States of America? You know, we can talk all day and all night about the niceties of terrorists infiltrating, and we got to look home first. But what do human beings do who are leaders, as you say, Mike, when they see hundreds of thousands of people starving and being murdered and tortured and running for their lives?
Are you asking me?
I'm asking anybody.
Well, it's a humanitarian crisis of unprecedented proportions. And I think that's part of the problem. Even well-intentioned nations like Germany, this is enough to overwhelm a large social welfare state. I mean, this is large numbers in a very short period of time. I mean, they are really stacking up at the borders. And this calls for, I mean, obviously an emergency plan. I mean, and that's where I think the nations of Europe are falling down, is they're not responding.
How about the nation of the United States? Well, first of all, does the panel agree or disagree that we need a Manhattan Project here? And, you know, the analogy is the Manhattan Project. We need to get on it and do something about it and deal with this humanitarian catastrophe.
I do agree with that. This is the time to open our hearts as a nation and to overcome the perception that we want to stigmatize and stereotype non-Western others. We have the resources to do that. And one other thing I'll say there is that the idea that structural unemployment would be caused by an influx of refugees is absurd. That is not the cause of structural unemployment in the American economy.
Mike?
I've got some reservations. My heart goes out to, when I see those images on television. I wish that something could be done, and I hope that some things will be done. And Paul says it's an unprecedented problem. Maybe. But it won't be for long. We live in a world of growing anarchy. We do. Just all you got to do is watch the news. One where emerging chaos is being fed by surging populations, environmental stresses, reaching critical proportions at just the time that the World War I system of nation states in the Balkans and in the Middle East that was created after the war is disintegrating. The result, has been and will be vicious ethnic and racial conflicts, and they're going to produce an ever-rising tide of refugees. When they're joined by the climate refugees, this is the new normal. So we solved the problem, let's say, perhaps for the Syrians. Then what next? Because this is a rising tide.
So
I'm suggesting that some problems are not solvable.
So are you saying that this is not an unsolvable problem?
I'm saying what I'm suggesting is we need to give it a really good shot.
What does that mean?
But well, I don't know. Apparently none of the nation states have a real good idea of what the answer is.
Well, the fact that people don't seem to know what to do doesn't mean that it doesn't need to be dealt with.
No, I'm not suggesting that it not be dealt with. I am suggesting that a precedent will then be established where we're sort of committed, morally at least, to continue to do this. And there's very quickly going to come a point where it is just not possible.
But we know it is possible now.
Well, we don't know that.
Oh.
I don't think we do.
Okay.
But Germany is stepping forward, and so we will have additional information on how their efforts succeed or not. And we're going through a period now of donor fatigue and agency overload in dealing with the current crisis, but I'm struck how an individual example, like the Syrian 3-year-old boy who washed up on a beach, did open people's hearts,
Yeah.
whereas the sheer numbers of 60 million refugees worldwide now don't. We need to make that connection in order to solve this
And
problem.
I think what Mike's talking about is that we maybe can't solve it, but from what we know now, we can at least ameliorate the
Right.
current crisis. Now, a lot depends, and I think what Mike is thinking about, a lot depends is we don't know how long this is going to continue and how many additional Middle Eastern residents are going to want to reach Europe. If we're near the end, and how do we know if we are or not? If we're near the end of the immigration, the migration from the Middle East, okay, then maybe we can handle it. But if there are another 750,000 coming, we do have a problem.
Can I just add this briefly? We don't know when it's going to end.
Right.
The Russians apparently are going to give Assad some real assistance. What if that works? We live in Assad's a bad guy. We suspect the Russians, but we live in a world where the choices are less and less good,
Right.
and we can't say we're not going to make one. And here we have the Republican candidates, by and large, saying, "Let's teach Putin a lesson of some sort by basically escalating."
Yeah, let's teach Putin a lesson via the refugees.
Right.
Well, we're going to have to wrap it up. I'm afraid it's not on a particularly happy note, or we haven't necessarily resolved anything, but I don't think we were planning to resolve anything.
They're not happy topics.
It's too complex.
Thank you for joining us on The Academics. We'd like to hear from you. Please contact us with your questions and comments at watchapptv.com. Until next time, I'm Lee Dunstan. Thanks for watching. Well.